There we go. All righty, everybody, welcome to the final panel of the day. This panel is titled No Home. So this is our, kind of light and fun panel to end the day on. We have some wonderful presentations here, and we're going to be kicking it off with racism in my D&D campaign, critical shenanigans towards fantastic oppression in D&D homebrew campaigns. And this is going to be presented by Luke Hernandez, Diamond Beverly-Porter, and Shonte Clement. So take it away.
Hello, everyone. Can you all hear me? We're going to do the seance once again. Can everyone see the presentation?
Yep.
Okay. So hello, everyone. My name is Luke Hernandez. I'm a graduate student at the University of Texas at Dallas, where I study art, technology, emerging communication, where I focus on queer game studies. And I'm joined with my amazing friend Diamond. Before she introduces herself, I want to say that Sho was not able to make it, but her story and experiences were very valuable to just our histories and campaign of D&D. So Diamond, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. Hello. My name is Diamond Beverly-Porter. I am a tenured track assistant professor with Washington State University, and I research culture, communication, and representation primarily with digital games. And I'm excited to present our paper, our shenanigans today.
Thank you, Diamond. In light to how this session's pre-light, we want to do something very informal, very fun, but just equally as critical. So I'm going to begin by saying how Dungeons & Dragons, D&D, was created as a rights space and built upon the legacy of racism in Western culture through applying a repetitive play and critical auto theory lens. BIPOC players such as ourselves challenge and work through these racist tropes, along with the myriad of oppressive practices baked into the serious gameplay narrative and design within D&D sessions. So we argue that homebrew practices and rules allow for decentralizing white culture in RPG spaces and expand a diverse play experience. This is realized through the act of sharing our situated experiences and coming to play Dungeons & Dragons together, and what made our quirky campaign transformative, at least for me. We hope by sharing our ambivalent fun times of laboring against the game's colonial roots, but also finding community. So our presentation includes the play experiences of the game itself and how our experiences against whiteness that is embedded in the system informed our play and our future. Within attention to care in the homebrew settings, it allowed for critical discussions and critiques against these harmful systems that take place in a fun, productive way. This generated a potion that mixed both frustration and joy from a Black and Latinx perspective about D&D. These complex negotiations of play and systems of oppression speaks to the critical turn within game studies and analog game studies. Historically, Black and Latinx RPG players and scholars have been rendered invisible, as seen in works like Rebecca Wanzo, and such how she points towards the intentional exclusion of Black and Brown experiences and nuance and interactivity within pop culture. There is systematic racism in D&D, and a path that we offer is through critical shenanigans that disrupts and subverts these oppressive, fantastic, and real components in the adventure. So does it all begin with boba? Maybe not. But I remember sitting with Diamond and Sho in a Korean restaurant in Dallas, where we began our session 0, the session where we all agree on rules, narratives, but also come to understand each other. Maybe because I'm older now or in grad school, but I knew the moment that we talked about the mechanics of consent and our own histories coming to the game of D&D was transformative and laid an important groundwork to our campaign and our community. Similarly, I find it important to share my own past experience with Dungeons & Dragons and how playing for the future invokes the past, my past, and my own past communities that still affect me today. It took a few tasters to find the homebrew I preferred, and it was actually my own dad who got me into playing Dungeons & Dragons. My dad loved playing D&D when he was a teenager, and he was often the dungeon master. The height of his D&D career was actually when he was serving time as a U.S. Marine, where he introduced the game to his fellow Marines. My dad would share to me often his memories of his campaigns and the wacky times he had with his Marine friends, but a complex reading of play and community can be generated here. I could assume that my dad and his fellow Marines bonded through D&D, thus crafting a particular community, and it was through roleplay, shenanigans, and banter that informed their play, which contrasted their routines as soldiers. Much can be said about the way the structure and play of D&D appeal to soldiers who are aiding in the imperial colonial project of the United States military, but also I want to bring attention to how many low-income Black and Brown people of color are incentivized to join for a promise of a better future. This is particularly true where I was born and raised in the city of San Antonio, where many poor Black and Brown communities and students are falling into joining the military or ICE, border control, creating this complex relationship between the oppressor and the oppressed. In this case, the paradigms of hegemonic and geek masculinity were made bare through the analog play of D&D. But what's funny about this past history is how I can assume the Marines playing D&D were operationalizing play to enact creative freedoms and subversive role play. That was not the case when my dad brought home D&D to our family. I have 2 brothers and 2 sisters, 5 in total, including me, and my dad figured that was the perfect amount of party players for a campaign. I'm not trying to blast my dad for his skills, DM skills, but oh my God, were the shenanigans not critical? They were play restrictive and normative. I remember this one formative experience where my younger self wanted to be a woman elf moon druid. I thought that was gonna serve so hard, but my dad made it clear that we couldn't play a different gender than our own. My sister also wanted to play a different gender, but my dad said no, and that was final. So I elected to be a bard rogue hybrid who was a jester with a hand crossbow, and to make light of it, and this is how I envisioned my character to be in my first campaign, a sad jester. But this moment revealed to me how normativity had to be arbitrarily enforced, yet queerness threatened to seep through at every turn. So when I went to college, I was not lucky and I was actually assigned to an all-males dorm. And on the dorm forum, there was a call for a D&D campaign, which piqued my interest. When I went to the group's first meetup, I felt that their session 0 that I did not belong at all. The space was very white male dominated, with many strong preferences to certain rules and attitudes. And things were said that made me immensely uncomfortable and not welcome, especially to me as a person coming into my queer Latinx identities. So that really turned me off of playing D&D for a while. And I like to invite everyone to reflect on their own histories of playing communal games and when they were shut out or when they were made uncomfortable. So when Diamond reached out to me and show and we began playing D&D, the experience was simply, as I put it, amazing as a queer person of color. I wanted to make it clear that sharing my past experience does not position the politics of D&D and its dominant communities as a past. Rather, my complex feelings of past experiences positions informs my current and future play. That's what made playing with Diamond and Show in the Homebrew campaign so cathartic, especially when together we acknowledge the troubling gamer culture and rules embedded in D&D. This led to an instance of playing queer fantasies, as we said, as this conference, evoking very much Jose Mendoza's queer futurity. So in Diamond's campaign, I made a queer tiefling rogue because stealing and demons appealed to me, and that's history, babe. Diamond actually had to rein us in our campaign because we were getting a little too wild with our queer fantasy, but call that Grand Theft Auto Forgotten Realms. But at the same time, we question why certain races are inherently evil and evoke racial otherness. Like, why do orcs and goblins throughout fantasy are evil and often quoted as black when artistically rendered? We also were uncomfortable with how the larger game mechanics of race determine attributes and attitudes, dangerously normalizing a racial science and eugenics that is hard-coded in the structure of the game. It's violent and still harmful, and we still are affected by it today. So a homebrew campaign that was intentional to Black feminist thought gave us a space to work through these structures and even play with it and against it. Towards the end of our campaign, Diamond did challenge us further of why we would kill indiscriminately, like, for example, why we often kill goblins. And Diamond will speak on that more. And it gave goblins a very crucial role in our campaign, which kind of differentiated a lot to my previous experience of playing campaigns. Rules were often experimented with and sometimes ignored entirely, and I would remember back following this experience. I'm not saying to throw away the rules, but an uncritical adherence to the rules and structure of D&D reaffirms its right masculine structure that the game builds off of. In the meantime, playing with Diamond Show allowed a moment where critique and play came together. And through the pictures provided, I carried on my own campaign experience to the analog into the digital with how my own character, Nier, was breathed new life into other digital games that have followed me throughout my whole life in the future. So I'll swing it on over to Diamond.
you. So in our homebrew campaign, The Adventures of the Yearning Moon, Yerna Bloodlove, and Anir Luna, played by Luke and Show respectively, set out on a low-stakes journey and are tasked with finding out the mystery of the missing pets in the town of Mollering. So the first adventure really allowed for us to establish our character dynamics and play styles in our homebrew campaign. And in past depictions, of course, of BIPOC in D&D, NPCs had either been rendered invisible or hyper visible as active quest objects rather than these kind of active components, or even just palette swapped NPC coded to be like European, basically. Thus far in our campaign, we have subverted these kind of historical D&D lore kind of usual tactics used. So this is done by characterizing and integrating monsters previously othered, such as the orcs or goblins or the swagan, the fish people, into the main plot with purpose. In our D&D campaign, I instead designed the orcs and the goblins and other deemed monstrous races as nuanced NPCs that are not biologically determined to be evil, and instead created nuanced communities and lived-in characters with aspirations and with ties to the main narrative and game world. So the world building and design of our campaign intentionally used design bleed in the construction of the narrative and environment. And Sabine Harper and Ida Toft define design bleed as, quote, a community affirming design practice which can be used as a tool for carving out shared standpoints. So The Adventures of the Yearning Moon is a nonlinear and heavily about the journey rather than the destination. It's player-driven narrative with active consequences and game actions, as Luke alluded to with the orcs and gameplay actions that they took. But during session 0 in my campaigns, I carved out a time where we went over boundaries, themes, consent, as well as just the content to discuss what we're comfortable with in our games. And game check-ins were revisit with these terms and these consent and boundary things, and that occurred pretty much every third game. So this open discussion intentionally subverts the dungeon master player kind of dynamic that's historically expected in D&D campaigns. Then moving on to the next slide, one rule for my campaigns is that we're all friends and active participants in each other's lives to the best of our capacity. So creating a safe, curious, creative space also means allowing room and space for survival in our current situation, of course, in America as BIPOC. As Toff and Sabine emphasized, situated skills, emotion, and life experiences as creators and players bleed into the way that we make and play games. So one stipulation in our campaign that stands out is the removal of character death. So in The Adventures of the Yearning Moon, player characters Yerna and Anir cannot die. And when a core gameplay function of D&D raises the stakes through fantastical violence and death, what does it mean to remove death from the game? So in conversation with Amanda Phillips, Necropolitics, quote, a way of thinking about political death worlds as they operate in the mechanics, representational violence and fantastical conquest are inherently built into the base gameplay of D&D. And then BIPOC are precariously positioned to experience intersecting inequalities inside this kind of fantastical game world, but then also outside the game space. I originally started playing D&D with these kind of pre-written campaigns. However, the lack of like malleability to the quest objectives and the NPC characters acted as a barrier to seeing myself reflected in the world of Faerun. So I instead adopted a method of cultural production mirrored in both fan studies and other Black gaming spaces to create the worlds that I wanted, and modifying existing content to be more nuanced and less binary. So in the worlds I created and that eventually became The Adventures of the Yearning Moon, BIPOC were not background characters in their own lands. Story format, time, and narrative were remixed to explore everyday tasks with care and curiosity. And of course, this is not to say that our adventure does not include violence or combat, but instead, combat is tied to narrative, nature, and character actions rather than just functioning primarily to level up player characters, exert dominance, or just killing of decidedly evil / monstrous characters. So there's room for the player to be neither entirely good nor entirely bad, and once again, diving into the messiness of life that is reflected in this kind of fantastical environment. So I built campaign arcs that center on changing character classes and stats with a backdrop of a magical girl anime. And in the campaign game world, the environment does not form around Anir and Yerna, and instead, the people, the land, the culture continue to grow and expand with or without their input. So the player characters are just one piece of the game world. And instead of the game world map being very human-centric and based upon discoverable areas, the map of the game world is instead charting the interactions of the player characters through their relationships with the land, the nature, and the people. And it's important to emphasize the complexity and nuance of every aspect of gameplay, rather than just sanctifying fantastical violence as a main mechanic and gameplay goal. And of course, to leave room for joy and, quote, diving into the messiness of life. Then moving on to the final slide. Gaming is a communal act. In the case of D&D, it's an opportunity to build worlds and stories together. And with the myriad of oppressive practices baked into serious gameplay, narrative, and environmental design in D&D sessions, we find that it is through this kind of disruptive and submersive practice communally created in our Homebrew campaign that we challenge the underlying ideology of games that reflects white supremacy and colonial models. So through meandering plots, dragons unexpectedly in dungeons, existential goblins, and unexpected visits to the Shadow Realm, we center joy in critical shenanigans. Thank you. And then here's our preferences.
Thank you so much.
Thank you guys very much. And you were like right on the money on time too. That was so impressive. Our second paper in this panel is titled Unsettling Homecomings, Indigenous Futurist Games, Decolonization, and Reimagining Home. And presenting it to us today will be Kari Gustafson.
Hello, let me just see if I can get my screen sharing to work. I think that should be correct, I'm hoping. Yeah, thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. My name is Kari Gustafson, and I'm a faculty member at Douglas College. I teach in the Disability and Community Studies program. So gaming is sort of an overlapping sphere, I guess, on the Venn diagram of my work. I'm not exactly a games scholar, but also do that. As we start today, I would like to position myself. I am a white settler, and I'm living as an uninvited guest on the unceded traditional and ancestral lands of the Coast Salish peoples, including the territories of the Katzie and Coquitlam First Nations. This is a picture here of the places where I go and walk and think and things like that. You may know this area more familiarly by its modern name of Vancouver, right near Vancouver, BC. So I am approaching this topic from a settler perspective because I think reconciliation is all of our responsibility. So I'm going to talk a lot about today about a game, specifically the game Coyote and Crow, which you may or may not have encountered. It's an Indigenous futurist game. This is an image here, or images here from their game materials, and there will be quite a few of those because they're pretty gorgeous, and I just used a lot of those images to in my slides, also to sort of inspire you about Indigenous futurist games. It is a tabletop role-playing game. It was kickstarted in 2021 and then published in 2022 by Connor Alexander and an entirely Indigenous game design team, including all the artists. So all the all the images are done by Indigenous artists. And the setting, as you can see, is an uncolonized North America. So this is the map here that really sort of sets the tone. It is a familiar place and yet not quite oriented the way that we usually would orient it. So that really, sort of flips things a little bit and makes the familiar unfamiliar in different ways right from the start. And my question is, how can Indigenous futurist games be a part of an intentional practice of reconciliation? So before going too much further into it, I think we should talk for just a minute or two about what is Indigenous futurism. This is from a blog post by Chelsea Vowell, who's quoting Dr. Grace Dillon, who's credited with coining the term Indigenous futurism in about 2003. It's discovering personally how we're affected by colonization and recovering some of the traditions to adapt. And I like this quote because I think it's interesting to note that for a settler-centric audience, like myself, post-apocalyptic settings are meant to sort of, or assumed to mean the end of society as we know it, right? But for others, the society that we know it is in fact perhaps post-apocalyptic. And I find that really both interesting and thought-inspiring there. And also it flips the lens. So instead of being under the watchful eye of the white anthropologist colonizer, we're viewing the outsiders through our own cultural lenses. So both of those are interesting twists on that. So very quickly, again, because I think most of us are familiar with a lot of game mechanics are really centered around the 4 X's, and that's sort of video games and board games, but also role-playing games as well. The sort of foil maybe, or the one that we tend to talk about being Dungeons and Dragons, and those are exploration, expansion, exploitation, and extermination, of course. According as Flanagan and Jacobson write in the book Playing Oppression, games embody the values to which the surrounding society subscribes. And if that's the case, I think maybe we should all reevaluate our values just a little bit. The exploration is still an important part of Coyote and Crow in Indigenous Futures games, though it doesn't practice erasure, exploitation, or removals of the people who are there in the same way, and focuses more on interactions. Story worlding is my word for the practice of role-playing games where the story and the world are emergent in the playing. It goes beyond both story and world and something we do together. So I sort of like to verb it that way. The story worlding in Coyote and Crow is intentionally meant to sort of function on a couple of levels. And this is described by Connor Alexander, different places. First of all, the uncolonized futures, and that's an image there from the back of the player handbook, that's meant to sort of be, what would it have been like in a future that had never been colonized. So in this way, it's kind of an offering to Indigenous gamers to see themselves and potentialities reflected in game content. And this, of course, is inevitably going to be a hypothetical because that's not the way things unfolded in North America or in the Americas, but it is based on sort of research and cultural knowledges and understandings that have been passed down. Decolonization, on the other hand, is the practice that's requested or maybe it should be expected of Eurocentric settler colonial folks like me. It is the interrogating, understanding, and transforming systems and practices through this lens of colonialism. So optimally, of course, done so along with or led by Indigenous peoples. And there's a danger here, as described by Tech and Yang in their article from 2012, that they remind us that decolonization is not a metaphor. Decolonization tends to be often, or really is about the repatriation of Indigenous lands and life. And it's not meant to be a metaphor for other things that we want to do to improve our societies. And plenty of decolonial work makes no mention of Indigenous peoples or notes their own contributions and as activists and intellectuals, etc. This type of Indigenous Futurist game does very explicitly. The game materials sort of speak directly both to native and non-native players and provide guidelines for story worlding together. And of course, in some ways, gaming is a metaphor. But as we all know, at the same time, they're not. Games are deeply transformative spaces where embodied learning and understanding can and does take place. So how exactly does this happen? Or what is Coyote and Crow doing to create these spaces? Both character creation and gameplay lean heavily into relationality in interesting ways that I think sort of set it apart. When you're creating a character, there's a mechanic called gifts and burdens, for example, where those are described as unique challenges, features, or resources that your character has access to or must deal with. It's quite an interesting game mechanic. You get 5 sort of points to spend on gifts and burdens in the system, and each level of gift costs you 1 point, whereas each level of burden grants 1 point. So you actually get to, if your character has these sort of levels of burden of responsibility in life, then you get points that you can add into other sort of abilities for your character. And there are people and situations that you could choose that would be both a gift and a burden. An example could be a younger sister who has a really strong skill at technology, but is also really dependent on you in other ways. So then that would make, first of all, adds to character complexity, but also really deepens the interrelationality. Paths are also something in this world that connect characters more strongly to the more than human world as well in interesting ways. Characters in this world choose a path in adolescence, and then in this sort of synthesis of science and spirituality that also challenges Eurocentric thinking, introduces animal tissues and characteristics into their character. Legendary ranks are used as characters sort of progress through the world and through the stories, but you can get too famous. Every time you gain a legendary rank in Coyote and Crow, you also get a new burden. And this really reflects the idea that if you have more wealth or power, not wealth really, but power, fame, whatever, you also have more responsibility in society. So winning something leads to new obstacles, new notoriety, etc. Backstories are also problematic, or not, they're problematic. You have to rethink backstories. I remember, in playing D&D, I tend to like to use like a street urchin backstory, for example. And that just really isn't possible in the world of Coyote and Crow, because children would not be allowed, they would never be sort of left to just fend for themselves in the streets. That's not the way this society would work. So that, there's things that we take for granted as being like a trope that just aren't part of the world. And that really changes you, so it makes you rethink the society that we live in. As far as gameplay goes, the setting, of course, is probably what most quickly springs to mind. There's relationships between groups and territories. The land is not uncharted or empty, but instead you're thinking about the relationships between the different peoples that are living there. One example as well of that I sort of was leading as a story guide my group through somewhere a part of North America or Makasing, which is the alternative North America, and they're asking, so what are we seeing? And you start describing it and you realize, well, actually, there would be a lot of bison here. There's not in our world. There would be here, and that sort of is coupled with quite a bit of sadness as well, right? Of what could be in the world that we do live in, and changing the way that we think about this as our home, right? In their downtime, it can be troubling, or not troubling, it can be a challenge when someone asks, can we get something to eat? I can't even tell you how much time my group has spent Googling lists of plants, animals, and foodstuffs that are native to the Americas. And that has been quite a learning curve as well. And I won't even get started on monsters. This is an image of one here, because that's a whole other talk. But you'll encounter very different ones here. Perhaps my favorite mechanic, though, game mechanic, is storytelling. So after an adventure, or like an episode in an adventure is finished, the group debriefs by each character telling the story from their perspective. And this is a way of intentionally embedding storytelling traditions into the game. But also it's just transformative of the group's understanding of one another and their community and the interrelationality. So at the same time, the core gaming materials really are not so different. It still feels like home as a gamer. You can start playing an Indigenous Futurist game in the same way you could start reading a novel, right? However, it plays with materials in interesting ways, like it uses a D12 system, which is, surprising, because there's not a lot of use of D12s. It's sort of like, hey, I've been here all this time. Maybe you didn't really notice me before. Watch what I can do. But can a game be part of reconciliation? Reconciliation is described on this website here as this is the Gordon Downey and Cheney Wenjack Fund website, establishing and maintaining mutually respectful relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. And it's a continuous process. And that has been sort of suggested that we can operationalize that through reconciliation, which is meaningful actions that move reconciliation forward. Aaron Trammell suggests that one good way to resist colonialism in gaming is to read, learn, and understand what the legacy of colonialism means for those who have lived through it and their descendants, which is absolutely a great idea, but perhaps also playing an uncolonized version of our own backyards in a serious and intentional way can be part of this understanding as well. I included this slide mainly because it's a lot of great resources that you can explore, and I would encourage you to. The image on this slide and the last one is the survivor flag, which is an expression of remembrance meant to honor residential school survivors. And the images and elements on it were chosen by residential school survivors, and they're described in detail on the website. But reconciliation is about recognizing where we are, where we came from, and where we're headed as a society in relation to Indigenous peoples. So If we're going to take the offerings of relationality and transformation in uncolonized story worlds like Coyote and Crow seriously, we must also understand the relationality between the colonized world we live in, the games we choose to play, and the people who create them, appear in them, and those we play it with. In that spirit, I want to leave you with some questions that can shape the actions we might take as a gamer, game master, educational gamer, etc. So what settings are you playing in? Which characters are at home in that setting? Who is not? Where is your game buying home? Would it be possible that it could be more local or perhaps Indigenous owned? Who's designing the games you play? How might you support designers, players, games, etc., who don't have a home or who don't feel at home in the gaming community? Coyote and Crow offers a model that actually supports Indigenous artists and creators, as do lots of Indigenous futurist context, and allows folks like me, white settler academics in high-paying positions, an opportunity for some armchair activism by buying native and even providing donations. I'm going to skip to the end here and say thank you so much for today. I can see that I'm out of time. That's all I have. Here's my resources, and I would encourage you to explore some Indigenous futurist contexts and to buy native if you can.
Thank you so much. All right, our third presentation in this panel is entitled Board Game Cafes, Consumption and Sociability in Japanese Urban Context. And presenting it to us today will be Allan Noves and Lizbeth Kanyat.
Hello, everyone. I am Allan Novaes, and my colleague is Professor Lizbeth Kanyat, and I will share with you my screen. Just a moment, please. Okay, so our presentation is about board game cafes in Tokyo, Japan. We study the concepts of third place and ibasho. That is, ibasho it's a Japanese concept in the urban context of Japan. And our background in the context of our research, well, Professor Lizbeth and I spent 2 months in Japan this year, from February until March this year, doing research that was derived from a research project at UNASP, Adventist University of São Paulo in Brazil, a university that where I teach and Professor Lizbeth teaches. And besides of that, we are we also were in Hitsumakan University. I spent there 2 months as a research visitor, and in this research visitor period, we conduct this research project in board games cafes. So I will give the words to Professor Lizbeth to continue our presentation. I believe it will be better this way. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Allan Novaes. Well, among the studies examining the challenges of Japanese society, particularly concerning the younger population, one critical issue stands out. This challenge falls under the umbrella of mental health and is loneliness and social isolation. Recent studies showed that 1 in 10 young adults in Japan say they often or always feel lonely, feel that they lack companionship, feel left out, or feel isolated from others. And more than a third of those who self-identify as lonely say they have felt isolated or lonely for more than 10 years. By age group, the highest percentage of loneliness is among people in their 20s and 30s. This concerning situation prompted the Japanese government to establish in 2021 the Council for the Promotion of Measures for Loneliness and Isolation. One of the key strategies for addressing this issue is to foster the development of communities where individuals can feel connected to one another. This involves creating spaces that facilitate interaction, mutual support, and a sense of belonging. In this context, board game cafes gain importance. As a type of coffee shop, a board game cafe serves as a space where predominantly university students and young adults gather to socialize, enjoy food, beverages, and engage in card games and board games. This study aims to examine the role of board games cafes as spaces of sociability and community building. Therefore, the concepts of third place and Iba show emerged as the theoretical framework of our research. The third place concept, popularized by the sociologist Ray Oldenburg, refers to social environments distinct from home, which would be the first place, and distinct from work, that would be the second place. So the third place are places where individuals come together regularly to engage in informal and relaxed social interactions. These spaces, such as cafes, parks, community centers, fosters a sense of community, belonging, and social connection beyond family and professional environments. They play a crucial role in social well-being by providing opportunities for casual conversations, relationship building, and exchange of ideas. On the other hand, Ibasho is the second central concept for our research. Ibasho is a Japanese term that conveys the idea of a place where one feels a sense of belonging, comfort, and purpose. It goes beyond physical location to encompass emotional and psychological dimensions, reflecting the importance of finding one's social niche and community connection for personal well-being and identification. So the objective of our research is to explore whether and how board game cafes in Tokyo embody the qualities of third place and Ibasho, and to identify the factors that contribute to their function as centers of social interaction. We have two specific objectives: to assess customary perceptions on board game cafes and third places, and as third places in Ibasho in Japanese urban settings. And the second secondary objective is to analyze the business model and operation characteristics of board game cafes that facilitate social interaction and community building. As for the methodology, we conducted an ethnographic study on the consumption of board game cafes. We made 10 visits to 9 board game cafes in Tokyo during March and February of this year to investigate the place, the people, and the play, the activities that took place over there. These techniques for data collection, the techniques for data collection were structured observation, participant observation, field diary, online survey with structured script, and in-depth interview with semi-structured script. So the technique that we apply for each empirical objects were the structure observation to investigate the place. Here we wanted to identify the characteristics and attributes of the surroundings the business model, and the interior design. We used the participant observation to analyze the play, the activities. The objective was to find the multiple activities carried out in a board game cafe, like, of course, gaming, playing, eating, drinking, exchange, sell, work, create, or game test, and socialize. And we also identified the titles and the genres of the games. We used the field diary to document the findings and insights from comparing observations to research objectives. The semi-structured interview we used to analyze the people and the play activities. We trace the demographic profile and behavioral profile of the customers. And we use the structured interview to understand the motivations for using a board game cafe and the social practices that take place there. So finally, we visit 9 board games cafes, as we show you. We did 36 interviews. Of course, this is a research with a qualitative approach. And we organized the findings into two strategies used by board game cafes to give the users the feeling of being in a third place in an IBA show space. The first strategy was what we called the play experience, and the second strategy was what we called the consumption experience. The play experience. This dimension focuses on actions and resources related to ludic culture and gaming practices that promote interaction and social inclusion. Here we point out 5 characteristics. Diverse game collection. Board games cafes curate a varied selection of game genres, themes, and dynamics, such as collaborative games and party games. The wait staff operates, they perform as hosts, not as employees or waitresses, but as hosts. In addition to serving snacks and beverages, wait staff in board games cafes are knowledgeable about the game's rules, and they recommend and explain them to customers. Also, there is a characteristic that is inviting social space. Unlike other Japanese spaces with more conservative social norms, such as work, public transportation, board games cafes are often open to louder conversations and laughter, spontaneous gestures, and physical proximity. Board games cafes create an environment that stimulates sociability and encourage authentic and spontaneous interactions. Game sales. Board games cafes often offer games for sale, allowing customers to extend their gaming experiences beyond the coffee shop into their homes and other personal and private settings. And playtesting. Board game cafes involve visitors in playtesting, fostering a sense of participation in the country's gaming market development. And the second experience that we identify on our research was the consumption experience. Board games utilize customers onboarding tactics to promote user retention and foster loyalty. These tactics include the use of social media, hosting thematic events, and more. There is loyalty programs. After a certain number of visits, a customer earns discount on their next visit. Also, social media communities. Board games maintain groups in platforms like Line, Instagram, YouTube, and others to promote their special activities, events, or competitions. And of course, there is a special agenda programming with programs that enhance the conventional gaming experience by offering additional options for entertainment, fun and social interaction, such as stand-ups, mates cafe experience, competitions, immersive theater, and, for example, spring picnics. And there is also food and beverage, the provision of snacks, light meals, or even full meals create opportunities to find shared interests and engage in longer conversations. As conclusion, the interviewees confirmed that the primary motivation for visiting a board game cafe after playing games is to make friends. We observed that games served as instruments for connecting people, a pretext for forming friendships, and bringing the gap between individuals and groups. It was confirmed that interactions that born on a board game cafe extended beyond a shared love for board games cafes. For example, friendships that were born in board games cafes, after that initial stage of a friendship, they started to meet outside the board game cafes and started to do other activities like fishing, playing golf, and other activities beyond the board games that they used to play together. So this ability to bring people together is amplified in board games cafes, especially when compared to other coffee shops, because the diverse game dynamics facilitates interactions between both familiar and unfamiliar individuals. More than 40% of the interviewees said that they used to go to board games cafes alone by themselves to play with other people that they meet there. And the board games cafes are prepared to match people that goes alone and put them in the same table to play together. It's very common. So various game genres allows customers to express interest in diverse themes and activities, such as history, art, science, botany, and others. So it is easy to find a common interest. The field research revealed that when common interests are identified, breaks for food and drink become opportunities to resume and deepen conversation. Even the journey to the subway provides a chance to exchange ideas after the playing in the board game cafe. Attending regularly the same establishment allows customers to become part of the community, leading to encounters with other regulars and enhancing connection. As a result of these interactions, we identified that customers made friendships, developed romantic relationships, and engaged in activities beyond the board game cafe. This proved that board game cafes operate as third places. And regarding the ibasho concept, the analysis also showed that this establishment provoke a sense of belonging and comfort due to the less normative environment and the acceptance of spontaneity. And customers use the board games cafes purposely to fight loneliness and isolation, to make friends, as well to train personal skills such as initiative and risk management. They also train social skills like teamwork and empathy, and they also train learning skills such as self-directed learning and problem-solving competencies. In this way, board game cafes also were considered as ibasho places. According to the findings, this study offers a comprehensive analysis of the features and initiatives implemented by board game cafes to foster community building, personal growth, and inclusion. By doing so, these establishments are positioned not only as third places, but also ibasho places, addressing social isolation and loneliness in the contemporary Japan. This was our presentation, and your feedback and insights are more than welcome.
Thank you so much. Our final paper in this panel is titled "It's All Fun and Games Till Somebody Loses an Eye: Ethnomethods of Bleed for Tabletop Roleplay." And it's being presented by Gerald Voorhees and Sarah Klein.
Stand by. I'm
Sorry.
getting the video. I don't want to just show you. Okay, let's see. Do we see it?
Yes, it's still framed though.
Oh, I thought I
It's
had
not
already.
full screen.
I will full screen it. It's just funny because last time I did that and then it left it. All right, I'm gonna mute. You want to take it away?
So, yeah, so Sarah, it's still showing your windows.
Okay, I will fix it again. Sorry about that. It's just that I did this last time and it did the opposite. Is it better or is it still the window?
It's still not showing the slideshow. It's showing the preview of the slideshow, which maybe is good enough. I don't know. Maybe we
I
should just get started.
can fiddle while you talk since we're in the first slide for a few seconds.
All right. Sure, let's go ahead and do that. So yeah, thanks. This paper is so we'll start the paper with a brief recounting of the moment of actual play that the presentation takes as a starting point, and therefore we'll also start with a content warning for narrative sexual violence. And in this talk, we're going to argue that there are limits to relying on conventional safety tools and protocols to ensure that players are protected from emotional harm and trauma of bleed out experiences that occur during tabletop role play. The inciting incident on March 24, 2020, a live stream of Far Verona, a cyberpunk-themed game, streamed on the Roleplay channel on YouTube. The character Johnny Collins, played by Elspeth Eastman, who is a synthetic humanoid. Johnny, not Elspeth, is the synthetic humanoid, seeks help from a mechanic named Rocket, played by GM Adam Coble. Rocket takes Johnny to a back room away from the rest of the characters and hits on him before plugging a device into Johnny that gives him a quote-unquote robot orgasm. Coble narrates the experience complete with blurred vision and buckled knees before saying through his laughter, quote, "I think maybe that's the last shot, the shot of the episode," end quote. This unwanted sexual encounter, a sexual assault, in fact, would be the final scene of not only the episode, but the entire game. A temporary break would be announced on March 31st, and that break would become a permanent cancellation. So in this way, the cancellation is an iconic example of what Montola and others game scholars call bleed, where the boundary of the game's fictional frames and the player's actual lives are breached. In much of the literature on the subject, bleed is an evocative name for the effect of blurred boundaries and leaky frames and signals both risk and reward. Seekers and theorists of bleed experiences tend to glorify bleed and related forms of play for their ability to provide profound positive negative experiences, to free players from social prohibitions, or to expand expressive capabilities of games and play. Without discounting these rewarding possibilities, our analysis ruminates on the risk, which which appears to us to have been under-theorized and grievously under-examined. So we focus on the sequential actions of the live stream play itself. Our analysis of the Far Verona exchange in question allows us to specify and deepen the concept of bleed, a phenomena of blended frames. Adopting an ethnomethodological orientation to tabletop role-playing gameplay, as accountable actions. We use the interaction to describe how bleed can happen, and importantly, how bleed is done. Ethnomethodology, coined by Harold Garfinkel, is an empirical orientation to the locally produced orders of meaning and interaction, which he called ethnomethods. Rather than being a particular theory, discipline, or analytic tool, ethnomethodological studies attend to situated moment-by-moment interactions, including the words spoken and other nonverbal actions such as pauses, overlap, tone, volume, and tempo changes. In our case study, we also attend to gesture, gaze, and interaction with objects in the environment. Through this framework of close attention to the actual interaction, the actual play, we specify 4 ethnomethods of bleed play through which character and player frames are acted upon by GMs and players. We see a vital contribution in this work in that it specifies how the bleed effect discussed in role-playing literature arises from specific techniques of bleed play that work to either disrupt or dismantle frames or to reassert and reinforce other frames.
All right. The March 24th section begins with the characters finding shelter in a mechanic's shop run by Rocket, who Coble describes as the rockabilly Bruce Campbell. While most of the players are healed by one another, as an older model robot, Johnny requires help from Rocket, who offers to take him to a back room so that he does not have to remove his chassis in front of the rest of the group. Vanna stops Rocket and Johnny in character as Haley and expresses concern about Johnny going off alone, reminding him of a recent betrayal by another NPC. We see her up with the blonde curly hair and the chihuahua in her lap, looking a little bit uncomfortable and perturbed. Coble narrates, Johnny, Rocket makes a face when he realizes Haley's going to come with you. He begins to describe the face before saying, actually, you know what? Can you make a roll? I want to see how much you can read his internal business here. In this instance, we can observe 2 ethnomethods of bleed in TTRPG play, one epistemic and one grammatical. The first is an ethnomethod of bleed, which is epistemic. It manages the boundaries between character and player knowledge. Coble paused the narration and imposed a die roll to determine how much subtext the characters would pick up on, specifically whether Johnny picks up on Rocket making a face when he hears that Haley intends to join. As Coble's initial response demonstrated, actually, you know what, can you make a roll? The die roll was not required, but actually a technique imposed to withhold information, enable intrigue and uncertainty, and build dramatic tension. This move hedges against the possibility of epistemic bleed in by utilizing the game mechanic to predispose Eastman to have Johnny decline Vanna's company and leave alone with Rocket. What's happened? I'll just continue. Working from Coble's ruling based on the die roll that Johnny doesn't pick up Rocket's internal business, Eastman proceeds to have Johnny reassure Haley that Johnny knows this guy from previously using his services and that they can trust him. It's notable that this past experience is imagined as a backstory rather than having been played through earlier in the episode or in the game. The decision to have Johnny decline Haley's company relies then on a tacit agreement between players that Johnny really does have a reason to trust Rocket. Trust between players is leveraged to establish support for trust between characters. Am I still sharing my screen? Because I'm only seeing Ed's picture. Okay, no worries.
Yeah, we can see it.
Awesome. Coble also employs a second TTRPG ethnomethod, this one grammatical, which heightens tension for the players. He begins by speaking to Johnny in the third person. He says he, Johnny, but concludes using second person tense to ask Eastman for a die roll. You know what, make a die roll. This technique of addressing the player as the character is really commonplace in many GM's repertoires, and it is usually intended to enhance player character identification and to enable bleed. But Coble takes this one step further by conflating the two in one single utterance. That is, by evoking both the in-character and out-of-character frames in the same statement, Coble is able to quote Montola, to simultaneously maintain a sense of alibi and to weaken the protective frame of the game. This form of address is far from uncommon, as Kobold has previously and will continue to address players in second person. And where it seems fairly mundane for a GM to tell players what happens when you press a button or that you are able to open the door, this mode of address takes on a different tenor when describing an unwanted sexual encounter at the end of the session. Despite Johnny by Eastman's repeated refusals, Kobold describes Rocket placing a device against a port on the back of Johnny's neck and stimulating a robot orgasm. His narration is entirely second person and seems to be cognizant of Johnny's lack of agency, at one point describing Rocket approaching Johnny with his hands up like you're a scared animal. Eastman, meanwhile, maintains the distinctions between player and character, turning on her voice modulator to say, she uses the voice modulator when she's speaking in the voice of the character typically, turning on the voice modulator to say, okay, sure, when Rocket indicates he's going to start the repair procedure, before speaking in her own voice as the player to narrate, Johnny has no idea what Rocket's going to do, no idea. Kobold proceeds to describe Rocket stimulating Johnny with the device and continues to grammatically conflate the third person and the second person. Employing this common grammatical ethnomethod as a technique of bleed play, Kobold facilitates bleed out at the table. By more closely suturing player and character and thereby better enabling identification and immersion, both Eastman and Kobold are primed to carry the affect from the gaming table out into their lives.
So in the scene that, as the scene continues, Johnny/Eastman give escalating and direct refusals. Shortly after the previous scene, Rocket compliments Johnny's chastity and describes him as beautiful, touching Johnny's face with the back of his fingers. Eastman's embodied performance here is brief but rich, weaving together character speech, pauses, and physical gesture, which Eastman actively highlights by redescribing in her narration. Eastman first mimes Johnny doing a gestural palliative of patting Rocket's hand before Johnny repeats the same tonal reversal as in the previous excerpt. Rocket says, "You're beautiful," and that is met with Johnny with a bright, very oblivious, "Thanks, buddy, that makes me feel great." While the two other players laugh, Johnny changes the subject back to the reason for the visit to the mechanic shop, the repairs. And Eastman then narrates Johnny stepping away from Rocket while also physically pushing her chair back from the computer. She says, "I'm just gonna take a step here, just a step." Eastman's bleed play is performed both bodily and grammatically, verbally highlighting her own / Johnny's actions here, while also performing the action is yet another escalation, which sutures refusals across the player and character frames in order to resist Rocket's advances. As Eastman continues her efforts to rebuff Rocket's advances towards Johnny, the shift between in-character and out-of-character frames is once again ambiguous. While the refusal is increasingly explicit, the matter of who is refusing, the player, the character, or both, is uncertain. Again, Eastman blurs and overlaps the frames not to transgress norms, but to maintain them in order to protect herself. This suggests that bleed play, the overlapping of frames, can, when examined closely, be a method of resisting and refusing the bleed effect. Eastman's active verbal highlighting of her character's embodied actions may also have the function of magnification or visual description, as if to say, in case you missed it, I am doing this. Similarly, Eastman mimes the hand of Rocket caressing Johnny's cheek, bringing the caress and Johnny's reaction into her own frame, in spite of the player-performer being physically in different locations.
This is very strange because our boxes are the same size as the boxes of the people that that we're talking about, and so it feels like we're in this game with them. But I'll talk about the last, I'll talk about the last ethnomethod here, which is the metatextual moves. It is at this point that Eastman interrupts Kobold's narration to clarify what Johnny can and can't recognize in this situation, and thus what he can and can't consent to. Eastman breaks character to say that while he has probably been the subject of others' affections, Johnny doesn't have the ability to reciprocate Rocket's amorous intent, saying, "I don't think he's ever been programmed to romantically to recognize attraction." Insofar as it is a negotiation of the boundary of player and character, This is a kind of bleed play as well as an interruption to the flow of role play action, and arguably it's Eastman's most explicit refusal. While Eastman's previous statement that I just recounted makes it explicit that Johnny can't consent to sexual activity, her response as Johnny is a pointed, though implicit, rejection of Rocket. Johnny says, "I don't want you to feel weird about anything, but I think it's kind of like when you have a glass of water and you're not really thirsty and you just kind of drink it. You know what I mean? Does that make sense?" Oh, I'm not on to the next slide, but I'll show you later. In this sophisticated performance spanning multiple frames, Eastman employs a final ethnomethod bleed play that operates metatextually. Johnny tells Rocket that he's not thirsty, evoking a slang term for sexual interest that Coble is aware of, as evidenced by his using the term during an out-of-character conversation with the players earlier in the episode. This language that could exist in the world of Far Verona, but certainly does exist in the primary frame of the social world, is the figure at the heart of Johnny's reply to Rocket, once again overlapping these frames. But in spite of the increasingly explicit refusals, Coble has Rocket say, "Don't be scared," and plugs in the device that gives Johnny a robot orgasm. Just having trouble with actually advancing the slide. So there's metatextual moves. Here's our conclusion. Having specified ethnomethods of tabletop role-playing bleed play and the risks and consequences thereof, our research suggests that further uptake of one-size-fits-all safety tools, like the one pictured in this slide, and protocols is not sufficient to ensure player safety. It's a challenge, we think, to imagine a world in which norms of care and accountability through communication could supersede the wants and desires of the audience to a monetized live stream. And yet, TTRPG performances with a broad popular audience are an opportunity to model flexible tools and approaches for accountable and responsive and caring play, over and against the pressure to, quote, "consummate the narrative," close quote. There's a near certain risk that a subset of audience members would oppose any protocol that interrupts their enjoyment of the narrative, especially if it's perceived to be associated in any way with feminism and/or the promotion of social justice. Likewise, there's a near certain risk that a subset of players will use bleed play techniques to compromise other player safety while placing the burden of responsibility elsewhere. These folks are going to do what they do anyway. Nonetheless, there was a vocal subset of audience respondents to this episode who would likely welcome TTRPG live streams that model protocols of care and accountability through communication. We offer this account and analyses here to emphasize the need and as a possible starting point for developing flexible, situated practices and protocols which do embody the values of care and accountability for TTRPG players and GMs who wish to contribute to cultural change. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much to all our presenters. So you guys know the drill. So we have our Q&A as well as the Discord. And I do see a question that is in the Q&A right now, so we can start with that one. So Elizabeth Brown asks, for Kari, we experienced some cognitive dissonance when playing C&C because, and spoiler alert here, if you follow the pre-written modules, you are forced to play in a police role, and we struggled to navigate this role throughout our play sessions. Have you interrogated this design choice at all?
Yes. I think it's I think it's interesting. Coyote and Crow, I suppose, as any Indigenous futurist or other type of futurist medium, it's not perfectly uncolonized or perfectly, not part of our world as it is. So there are some interesting choices in there. Another one to mention in Coyote and Crow would be like the existence of like gun-like weapons, for example, and how those are shaped, of course, by the world we live in. I think, though, it's also interesting in sometimes to reading or I guess the way we read the text itself is also through our own sort of colonized lenses, right? So that then you're sort of in this, I guess, system that loops back on itself, right? That you're a part, that it's also your reading of the different things, like the police role. Is it police, or is that a lens that I'm, that we're sort of also putting on something else that may not have to be policey, if one sort of again plays it with intentionality, I guess, is what I think a lot of it comes back to, in my opinion.
Thank you. If y'all don't mind, there was another question as well that was answered via text, but I'd like to just kind of throw it out there for the rest of the room as well. So this is a question for Lizbeth and Allan. Were you able to observe self-organizing within the Board Game Cafe attendees? For example, did people who liked specific kinds of games, strategy versus role-playing versus party games or the like, tend to socialize together more?
Yeah, I'll read the answer that we prepared. In our observation and interviews, we realized that most of the regulars were casual gamers and not hardcore gamers. That's why the division mentioned in the question was unusual. But when it did happen, it was usually related to themed events promoted by the Board Game Cafe. The most common division that we observed was that of gamers who came with friends from outside the Board Game Cafe and solo gamers who come to meet new people. And about the game's dynamics, of course, party games often promoted more conversation and interaction between people that weren't friends before, that were just meeting in the Board Game Cafe. Role-playing strategy games were more played by groups of friends. Also, party games were played at the beginning of the night or at the first open hours of the Board Game Cafe to engage people to meet each other. And after a few games of party games, people met their interest and move on to other games with smaller groups.
Thank you very much. I also have from the Discord kind of a question and comment from Sarah Lynn Bowman, who wrote, I have been thinking a lot about philosophies of safety lately, and I think we put a lot of pressure on safety tools to quote unquote solve issues of calibration and consent, and also larger issues of cruelty and predation. To me, safety tools are the beginning of much larger processes of awareness, compassion, and communication, not the end of the conversation. But it sounds like some people assume that just having a tool in the first place makes things automatically safe. So just kind of open to any of the panelists here. What do you think of that? And kind of what is your response to this idea of, the presence of tools maybe being necessary, but not sufficient?
I mean, so we didn't tell this as part of this version of this presentation, but one of the things that the GM of this game, of this series, said after this event was that, usually they put in like protocols and they do lines and veils and stuff, but they didn't, and that's his bad. And that was a kind of like interesting post hoc application of the argument that I think Sarah's just suggested, the idea that you can do this and then it makes things safe, as though that would necessarily have solved things. And I think that what we show here is that like there's plenty of opportunities for him to recognize that the player is uncomfortable and doesn't want to proceed. There's lots of escalating indirect refusals. And so having had this structure in place before doesn't seem as though it would have changed that. But yeah, no, I fully agree that it's the starting point. And that's, I think, maybe the problem or a problem with the idea of having a tool is that it seems somehow complete. And that's kind of why you know, we say tools or protocols, you know, like a protocol is something that can be developed and reiterated and revisited. And I think that flexible is the key thing here, that it's like all of these interactions are happening on the fly. And in this case, Gerald, anytime you want to jump in is fine. But in this case, especially a kind of like awareness and acknowledgement, which we don't hear about in these kinds of conversations, about the pressure of the live stream to keep the story going. That is a particular thing which is not happening in people's homes to the same degree, or even in board game cafes to the same degree, right? So what could be deployed that would you know, respond to that pressure and the risk that is entailed by that pressure?
Yeah, I think this paper started out, or maybe it didn't start out, but the first sort of effort we organized it around was like, okay, let's try to do some work that's going to help re-theorize like how how we do safety at the table as not simply a tool, right? But as a very thoughtful, deliberate, intersubjective process. And then I guess like through the course of writing the paper, we came to recognize, well, that's a pretty big step. Maybe we could just start by specifying some ethnomethods of play that's often involved in these sorts of situations, and by figuring out these different forms of and techniques of play, maybe that will be a footing to help us eventually start thinking about how people can be conscious of them and relate better by being aware and deliberate about these things. Yeah, but it's a wonderful thought and provocative thought from Sarah. Thank you.
Did any other panelists want to jump in on that question? If not, I do have another question from an anonymous attendee who asks, I'm curious about bleed and playing games where colonization or marginalization is the theme, particularly when those games are played by white players. Can this foster empathy or lead to appropriation, or both? And again, I think, this could be aimed at multiple panelists here.
I can start, I guess. I think probably lots of people probably have something to say about this in this panel, I'm guessing. Yeah, 100%. And I wrote something similar to it, I think, in the Discord, that yeah, absolutely. I would say both is true, right? And that's what I think I was going to quote Evan Turner from earlier, saying the discomfort is the transformation, right? And I think that at least I think thinking about trying to move forward with decolonization and reconciliation and things that are really, really important, it is not always going to go well. And there are a lot of people who have created, again, safety guidelines, right? And one can try to live up to them and try to do better next time, etc. But not doing it is not really an option. So at least in my opinion, that it's to try to live up to the standards as well as we can, and then be willing to learn and apologize and try again, is really important. But absolutely, there's a danger of appropriation and lots of other things.
I guess
I mean, I think,
might.
sorry, go ahead.
Okay, sure. Sorry. Yeah, so I might just chime in and say, I think this is also a very interesting and provocative question. And I don't have a great answer to it. So instead, I might just raise a counter question of perhaps bleed isn't the right word, for this sort of situation, because it's I don't know. It just doesn't seem to me as explicitly about the blurring and or conflation of fiction and real life frames, so much as a distinct what am I, a conscious what am I learning about these spaces, or possibly how am I not being reflexive, and how am I not learning and actually mucking up these spaces. But yeah, so I would just wonder if like bleed is the right concept to bring us through that question, but it's a very interesting one. So thanks.
All
I
right.
kind of,
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just gonna also wonder about this question, and I think that bleed could be a way to think about this, but I guess the question is, like, are we thinking about bleed, like bleed as an effect that might happen that could result in empathy as a kind of goal, like as the designer's aim would be to have an empathetic reaction, an empathetic phenomenon happen within a white player that changes their relations to you know, people and situations and politics in the quote real world. But as to the kind of appropriation or empathy question, I mean, like, I think yes, some person's experience of empathy might look like someone else's experience of appropriation, and I don't know that we can, you can just go on any comment section or anything, any whatever person, Twitter tweet of the day person, and see like various responses to somebody that's like, someone says you're doing good work and someone says no, you're doing terrible appropriation and you're being pandering. Like, so I don't really know the answer to that other than I think it always is going to do both, because it's always going to be subjective to the person who is experiencing and or witnessing that. And that's kind of one of the tricky things about these kinds of games where your aim is to educate or your aim is to create some kind of radical praxis within the game, because the people that are showing up there might not feel like they want to coach some white person through their guilt around being complicit in colonization or marginalizing folks. But if that's the situation that is happening there, then I don't know, you have to play that through in some way, whether that is confronting the, you know, confronting that or being really gentle or whatever. I mean, all of that is the what happens, I guess. So I think that's bleed, but I think those kinds of things would have different methods than probably what we talked about in our presentation.
Thank you so much. We have time for one more question. If someone has one handy, either in the Q&A or I'm trying to peek over in the Discord as well. Or if any of the panelists have a question for their fellows. If not, thank you so much for an amazing first day. We very much look forward to seeing everybody tomorrow. Did Ed or Aaron or any of the other organizers folks want to do any last announcements here?
Not an announcement, but I will echo exactly what you said, that this has been a fantastic day. I enjoyed this panel greatly, and all the other panels, and I'm really looking forward to tomorrow. I posted on the Discord server last night that I felt like I was waiting to open a bunch of presents this morning, and indeed, a bunch of presents were opened, and there's a bunch more for us all to open tomorrow.
All righty. Thank you guys so much. We will see you soon. And I hope you have a good rest of your evening or morning, whatever time it is, wherever you are.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye
Bye-bye.
all. Thank you.